Good evening. Hello. I'm Beth Golay, and as the chair of the Howard Wooden Lecture Series, and on behalf of the Friends of the Wichita Art Museum, I would like to thank you all for attending this evening. Before Patricia introduces our speaker, I'd like to give you a little background on the lecture series. All of our Howard Wooden lectures are made possible by the members of this Friends group, which established our endowment fund. It started back in 1985 when Howard Wooden, the director of the Wichita Art Museum at the time, suggested to the Friends group that an endowment fund could be developed as part of the Art Museum's 50th anniversary celebration. In 1997, the Endowment for Exhibitions and Acquisition of Art was established, as well as the Library Fund. Then 3 years later, the Howard Wooden Lecture Series was created to fund lectures at the Wichita Art Museum with the caveat that all lectures would be free and open to the public. Now, all of the Friends endowments are managed by the Wichita Community Foundation. Over the years, these endowment funds have grown from $234,000 to just over $3 million. We have given the museum over $2 million to date for art acquisitions, materials for the library, and to make these educational lectures available for free. And now, Dr. Patricia McDonald, the director of our Wichita Art Museum, will do the honors in presenting to you our speaker for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, and welcome on such a lovely evening. Acknowledge again, this is a gathering that is a program of the Friends of the Wichita Art Museum, really a beloved volunteer group who is part of countless activities and events that we do at the Art Museum. I particularly love that this is a lecture series that honors a former museum director. Howard Wooden was the director here from 1975 to 1989. It's really a grand thing that we remember him. He was beloved here in Wichita, and I know our speaker also would heartily agree with me that it's wonderful to remember someone who's given important service to an organization. We welcome a speaker this evening with important roots in Kansas, but also a really incredible impact on the national scene. Dr. Charles Eldredge, who's the Hall Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of Kansas, Emeritus because he's retired just this year. So I'm going to return to Dr. Eldredge in a minute, but I want to acknowledge that when we invited him again to Wichita and to the Wichita Art Museum, we did that in conjunction with our current exhibition, Kansas Land, that is a documentary photography show that offers a stage to two really extraordinary documentary photography projects. So when we realized that there were two groups, two circles of faculty members, professors that were researching farming in Kansas at the University of Kansas, and also that they had documentary photographers, distinguished documentary photographers who attached to them, we felt that we in Wichita really needed to give a stage to those projects and those photographers, and it was a really smart decision, and it's beautifully realized in our galleries, if I say so myself. To fulfill our mission, we organize exhibitions like Kansas Land, but we only get to do that because we have such savvy and generous patrons. So I want to acknowledge them at the moment. Support has been provided by the DeVore Foundation, Doug Brantner, Sonia Gredeman, and Chris Brunner, and Sandra Langle. All the exhibitions at the Wichita Art Museum receive really generous support from the Friends of the Wichita Art Museum, who is also sponsoring this evening, and the City of Wichita. And I also want to acknowledge Reuben Saunders in our town, Reuben Saunders Gallery. He helped with the framing for the exhibition, and his help with that framing was really spectacular. So thank you, Reuben. If Kansas and farming in Kansas was the theme for our exhibition, then we really wanted to hear from our speaker this evening, Charles Eldredge. He's been involved in research on the Kansas artist John Steuart Curry for quite some time. Curry, of course, is one of the 3 poster artists for American Regionalism, or American Scene Painting, which is Thomas Hart Benton, Grant Wood, and John Steuart Curry. Their first exhibition together, although they became nationally prominent, the first time they appeared together occurred in Kansas City. And Eldredge has written about Curry. He's written about Curry and his Kansas roots, and connection any number of times, but a really important piece that he contributed to the Artist Retrospective in 1998. Charles Eldredge has just retired, as I acknowledged, after 42 years at the University of Kansas. In fact, Eldredge is a really big deal in American art history circles overall. There is an annual award that is given for the best article that appears in the journal American Art that's published by the Smithsonian. And guess who that prize is named after? Eldredge was director at the Spencer Museum that's at the University of Kansas from 1971 to 1982. He was snapped up by the Smithsonian after that. He became director of what's now called the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and he was there from 1982 to 1988. Apparently, 6 years of politics in Washington, D.C. was enough for him, and he returned to become a professor at the University of Kansas. And he has distinguished himself since with an outpouring of sharp scholarship. His publications, his national board service, his awards of excellence, they consume pages. I started on the chore of counting the number of books he's published, and I stopped. And actually, I thought one measure of his importance is also the lives that he's touched. So I want to use the Wichita Art Museum just as a microcosm of that. When I completed my PhD at Brown University, Charles Eldredge was one of the outside readers for my dissertation. Our WIM curator, Tara Hendricks, has a bachelor's degree and a master's from University of Kansas, and she really considers Eldredge a pivotal guide to shaping her art history, but also to her career. And I would tell you, our museum is not exceptional. And we're talking about an art museum, we're not talking about an art history department. So think about our museum as a microcosm for the impact that Charles Eldredge has across the country. He's really valued for his alert mind, his reach of history, his very subtle analysis, and I would tell you as well, the warmth of his friendship and ongoing advice to so many of us. So please help me to honor Charles Eldredge at a milestone moment for him.
Thank you, Patricia. I think we should end it right here. You're going to give me a swelled head. It's a delight to be back in Wichita and to have an invitation to speak to you about Kansas art, and one in particular, Kansas artist John Steuart Curry. We will be talking about curry, corn, and Kansas. It sounds like a recipe from a Midwestern cookbook contributed by some South Asian chef, but it is a title that occurred to me as I was looking at your wonderful painting upstairs, the cornfield imagery of John Steuart Curry. You know the artist by reputation and by his Wichita representation. The artist whom you see here as a young schoolboy painter at his easel, probably about 1916 on the right. On the left, a self-portrait from a decade or so later, the late 1920s. where he proudly, if arrogantly, stares into the mirror and paints himself as a kind of modern Parmigianino. You may know the artist, surely you know the artist, as decorator of the Kansas State Capitol, John Brown, and other mural decorations that are perhaps the grandest suite of such paintings in the state or in the region. Or you know him as a regionalist hero, painting local mores like baptism in a farm tank, on the right-hand side of the screen, Baptism in Kansas, 1928, and a photograph of a similar event in Kansas sometime in the years approximately around Curry's childhood on the left-hand side of the screen. So John Steuart Curry's is a tale of Kansas, and I would suggest of homecomings. Kansas schoolchildren of Curry's generation learned lessons of good behavior and responsible citizenship along with their 3 R's. For instance, one primer widely used at the time instructed that, and I quote, "To herself, Kansas has always tied her children with an attachment that amounts to devotion." In a community and an economy that was still largely agricultural, parents and pupils alike would respond positively to the message that, quote, "the land always had a fascination for men of talent, learning, and genius," unquote. Men, and women for that matter too, like the Kansan Curry. Now, whether the young Curry actually studied from that particular grade school volume is impossible to know, but its general message of patriotic virtue and regional pride surely bore fruit in the work of the farm boy turned artist. By Curry's day, and his day extended from 1897 when he was born to 1946 when he died, not yet 50 years old. By Curry's day, the Midwest had exercised its peculiar spell for several generations. Late in the 19th century, Hamlin Garland, author and Midwest booster, proclaimed the region's artistic possibilities. In lieu of travel to Europe or Eastern art colonies, he urged attention to the local, proposing that the Midwestern artist, he said, being denied certain picturesque aspects of seashore and mountainside, has a rare chance to develop unhackneyed themes in sky and plain. Like Garland, Curry also delighted in the pictorial possibilities of Midwestern life and urged his neighbors to recognize the same, saying, "There's art right here in our rolling green hills, dotted with the white of farmhouses and the red of barns. We have art also in the shine of brown earth as it rolls from the plowshare, in the swing of the fork as the hired man scatters haycocks after an untimely rain, and in the healthy gusto of threshers." Such were the sights that informed Curry's vision during his childhood spent on a farm near the settlement of Dunavant, that no longer exists, in Jefferson County, which does still exist, Kansas. And such were the subjects that vaulted Curry and his regionalist colleagues, Missouri's Thomas Hart Benton and Iowan Grant Wood, to prominence in the American art scene in the 1930s. On the left is Time magazine cover from December 1934 that introduced the trio to a broader American public, featuring a self-portrait of Benton on the cover. Curry's recognition, however, even preceded that of his associates on Time magazine. His Baptism in Kansas painting, on the right-hand side of the screen, dating from 1928, won headlines when it was purchased 2 years later by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney for her new museum in New York City. And there you see the doyenne of modern art circa 1930 with her new trophy. At last headlined the New York Times, quote, "Kansas has found her Homer." I don't know whether they meant the Greek or Winslow, but either way, it was flattering. It was the rural environs of Kansas, and particularly of Jefferson County, which prompted such imagery in Curry's art. Those same environs and experiences were, however, the subject of ambivalence during Curry's adolescence. In 1916, from Chicago, where he was studying at the Art Institute, he wrote longingly to his mother, "I wish I was in the country. I sometimes feel like coming home and hauling manure." Finally, however, artistic aspirations triumphed over agricultural, and Curry confessed, quote, "I would rather draw a picture of myself shoveling manure than to do it." Now, Curry's self-portrait with manure does not exist today, at least I've never found it, and likely it never did. But in numerous other Kansas images, portraits, genre scenes, landscapes, Curry immortalized the beauties as well as the occasional terrors in the hardscrabble life of the Midwestern farm. Tornado in Kansas, 1929. To some critics, it appeared ironic that such memorable paintings of Kansas were being produced in Curry's studio, which was in the bohemian art colony of Westport, Connecticut, remote from the source of their inspiration. Here you see Curry during those years at some costume party in that colony, dressed up as a sheik of Araby or some such get-up, not in his farm boy dungarees. Curry, however, would have agreed with the Salina-born Thomas Craven, a prominent New York art critic and the Regionalist leading champion. Craven, who bridled at what he once called, quote, "the aimless carpings of the metropolitan scribes who know nothing about America save from hearsay," unquote. That great trans-Hudson West of which Curry and Creighton were well familiar. Unlike the Eastern critics, from the late 1920s onward, the artist made occasional pilgrimages back to the heartland to visit family, to sketch the landscape and the locals, and generally to recharge himself, like some agricultural Antaeus returning to native ground. Yet even in his maturity, there were clues to his continuing ambivalence regarding the farm subjects on which his reputation resided. For more than a decade, he knew the Midwestern farm only as a visitor from Chicago, from Paris, where he also studied, from New York and Connecticut, a pilgrim for whom the return meant not only filial duty, but also good business, and really inspiring the themes that made him a champion of regionalist art in the 1930s. In the artist's mind, as well as on his easel, the farm may have meant more than a baptism or a storm cellar, perhaps as suggested by his design for a war bonds poster in the 1940s, the farm is a battleground too, a subject as much personal as patriotic, the locus of struggle as well as a source of strength. His trajectory outward from Midwestern farms and villages to urban training grounds to Europe and then the return homeward was shared by many of Curry's contemporaries, including Benton and Wood. Each of them responded to the experience of repatriation in his art. Curry preceded both of his comrades in treating the prodigal theme, which appeared in the late 1920s during his first fervid period of Kansas imagery. One version featured the dungareed young man feeding hogs before a distant barn in what Curry called, quote, "one of the best watercolors I have ever done." I've never found the watercolor, only this very dark image of it, but even there you can certainly read the subject matter, one which is reminiscent of his admiration for Albert Durer's Prodigal Son and other prodigals by Rembrandt, and the list is long. He especially admired the Durer, he explained, for the manner in which the artist gave, quote, not only a good interpretation of the repentant prodigal, but also a good account of a farm scene in Germany in 1495, unquote. Curry also seems ultimately to have preferred the depiction of Kansas actualities in 1929 to the placeless, timeless, biblical subject essayed by others, both of his generation and earlier. The appearance of a portrait of the prodigal's father in Curry's first one-man show in 1930, on the right-hand side of the screen, was unexpected. It was presumably inspired by one of the occasional homecomings that happened to be photographed in the 1920s on the left-hand side of the screen. The painting, titled The Stockman, was painted the year before the exhibition and portrays his dad, T. Smith Curry, in his Donovan barnyard. At the time of the exhibition in New York, the painter expressed pride in his, quote, remarkable father. whose prosperity and worldliness he recounted to the New York Times. The senior Curry, for instance, had astonished his neighbors by taking his bride on a honeymoon to Europe at a time when, by one account, for most Kansans, quote, a journey to Topeka was their trip abroad. According to John Curry's biographer, the artist was resolute in his belief that, quote, the American farmer is no peasant, but a proud individual who claims the right to own his farm unmortgaged, to pay his taxes, raise and market the vital crops, educate his children, and above all, to live and act as a free and independent citizen. That, he concluded, is what Curry saw in his father and idealized in the stockman. Elsewhere, however, the son's words and images about farm and family, and particularly father, suggest some filial ambivalence, perhaps the inevitable lot of the prodigal. Because his wife encouraged her eldest son's interests, Smith Curry, the father, tolerated the art lessons, the distractions, and the expense. In a candid moment, the artist once acknowledged, I turned out to be a great satisfaction to him, and also a great surprise. I think that for some years he about gave up hope that I would ever be anything but a liability financially. Unlike his supportive mother, however, Curry maintained that his father, quote, had no leanings in that art direction, and he described him simply as, quote, a fattener of livestock, who fed Herefords for market until they were so large that, quote, the rain set in the middle of their backs. Beasts like those who accompany Smith Curry on the right. The stockman poses the subject amidst and looming over the flock of prized livestock. With booted feet firmly planted in the mire, his figure controlled by firm outline and darkened shading, Smith Curry sternly dominates the composition, superior to son and visitor, an imposing, even intimidating figure of authority, like some barnyard pantocrator looking down on us and the painter. This masterly figure of stern, unsmiling demeanor maintains order with strong body and personality, and with a whip. The stockman's rectitude is echoed in the concrete silo behind him, a marker of prosperity on Kansas farms of the early 20th century. Here you see the silo as it exists today, the home, the barn, and the cattle all having left, now replaced by acres of soybeans, but the concrete silo still punctuates the landscape. The towering cylinder also carried sexual connotations, suggesting a rustic prairie priapus. The stockman, tellingly not titled My Father, nor even Portrait of Smith Curry, but the stockman, stands as an emblem of good breeding, suggesting a preoccupation with livestock bloodlines more than with sentimental ties or ancestral pride. The towering figure appeared as well in Our Good Earth on the right, initially this lithograph in 1938, later a painting, and later yet a war bond poster, where he looms over children and the waving wheat, a symbol of the fecund prairie which Kansans, like the novelist Margaret McCarter, revered because, she said, it grows the best grain and the choicest fruit and the finest stock, and most of all, grows men and women, like those sprouting at the farmer's feet. And the pose appeared most famously, perhaps, in Curry's Topeka State House murals, where John Brown unfurls his might over a crowded landscape of fire and storm. When their son's commission for the State House murals was announced, the greatest award imaginable for any Kansas artist, Mr. and Mrs. Curry were absent from the press conference honoring the painter. According to newspaper reports, the parents remained at home on the farm, he preferring to thresh and she to busy herself with housework. When Curry painted his parents, as you see in this 1929 example, the parlor certainly looked tidy and the harvest well threshed. However conflicted his attitudes toward his father might have been, Curry periodically returned to visit family, providing occasions for such portraits as this, paintings that illustrate aspects of Kansas farm life of the era. And there's a fine example from a subsequent visit in 1933 hanging in the galleries upstairs. William Allen White once cautioned his distant urban readers that, quote, because we live in country towns is no reason why city dwellers should assume that we are natives. You will find that all the things advertised in the backs of magazines are in our houses. So it was on the Curry farm, where everything was up to date, including telephones, electric fans, and other modern conveniences advertised in the backs of magazines. Here you see a telephone on the wall, electric fan cooling Mother Curry. Rural Kansans followed trends in decorating with the same interests as their contemporaries in Kansas City or beyond. In Sod and Stubble, his classic novel of Kansas farm life, author John Ice described a widow of this period whose daughters urged her, quote, to have the parlor carpet torn up, the floor planed and polished, and a rug put down because town people were treating their floors in that way. So too was Mother Curry, it seems, at least to judge from her son's painting. Margaret Curry illustrated the rural sociologist's claim that, quote, the farmhouse is a symbol that expresses the thinking of the people who live in it. In this case, indicating a cosmopolitan aspiration to life's finer things. Among those things was the telephone, which hangs on the wall behind Smith Curry, an instrument that was then still a rarity in much of rural America. Such instruments dramatically changed lives, broadening the world beyond the confines of one's immediate family and neighbors, and redefining community, now linked telephonically. Rural Kansans delighted in such progress, which brought the telephone, the radio, and other modern miracles to their homes. For all of its modern touches, however, the Curry household was still deeply traditional in the values and rituals it sheltered. Father gazes out the window and away from his painter son, looking upon the barns, pastures, and livestock, the basis for prosperity, hard won. In his coarse and calloused hands, he grasps a newspaper, doubtless the Kansas City Star, which Curry recalled his father reading, a link to the larger world of business, politics, and masculine affairs. By contrast, Mother looks inward, literally and figuratively, absorbed in the feminine task of knitting. Her delicate wicker rocker is all frills and curlicues, while his manly seat is plain, sturdy, and oaken. Curry's penchant for selecting subjects symbolic of universal experience was the basis of his popularity, both then and now. That his themes were familiar from his Kansas upbringing was but incidental, wrote one of his partisans, for he said, these are great experiences of life that are universal, and the power of John Steuart Curry's paintings transcends all scenic localisms, unquote. Another writer described Curry's painting of his parents as, quote, an idea portrait of the folks at home, a concept that could evolve into other domestic vignettes. These ranged from various genre subjects to large murals, such as the Kansas Pastoral of farmer and his wife in an unmortgaged farm that concludes the capital suite of murals in Topeka. When he returned from the East to visit his parents in 1929, Curry's painting interest drew him beyond the familiar terrain of northeastern Kansas to the south-central part of the state, to Barber County, on the Oklahoma line southwest of Wichita, there to vacation and sketch at the Hart Ranch. The sketches he made there that summer and during the next as well provided the basis for his distinctive views of the Kansas landscape created during the 1930s, by which paintings a generation of Eastern connoisseurs came to know the lay of the heartland. The ranch country of Barber County, photographed on the right, and surely familiar to some of you not far away, was the inspiration for the painting Spring Shower on the left, one of the treasures of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, by which Easterners knew something of the Western landscape. The Barber County gypsum hills were wilder than the farmlands of Jefferson County and the Kaw River Valley in the northeast part of the state. The rolling emptiness of the red earth country pulled the eye to the distant horizon, and with it the imagination. In Spring Shower and other views based on the Hart Ranch studies, Curry described a terrain more rugged than the cultivated acreage of his native precinct. The ranching country was hostile to the cultivation of most of the sort practiced in northeastern quadrant of the state or elsewhere in the regionalist terrain. Curry's intent was, however, not like that of his Iowa contemporary Grant Woods, to advertise the fertility of the land. The emptiness of the gypsum hills seemed productive primarily of mood, a haunting drama in the sweeping expanse which is marked but not managed by human intervention. In Spring Shower, man's hold on the land is slight. Barn and farmsteads set in the middle distance sit lightly on the wavy upheaved plain across which roads and gullies lead the eye to the juncture of land and sky. Often Curry viewed the scene from a slight foreground rise, which vantage increases the sense of the spacious plains. His biographer noted that Curry's landscapes, quote, use space to express moods that vary from the utter physical abandon to a quiet, spiritual, almost romantic dreaming, even yearning. To native son William Allen White, these wide Kansas expanses were reminiscent of the Russian steppes, a vast mystical terrain, he said, where sky and earth unite. Mystical, romantic and spiritual, physical abandonment. Is this the way we think of Kansas these days? For some, the high plains clearly had the capacity to stir, even as they lacked any of the conventional attributes of landscape scenery. Playwright William Inge, another Kansas native, used to delight in recounting the beauties of his native state, boasting that here in Kansas there were no mountains in the way. Kansas poets wondered, quote, who would choose a small land where granite narrows all horizons? In this landscape, wide and airy, the sky dominated in a manner unfamiliar to outsiders. To explain the peculiar effect required a long familiarity, such as Willa Cather. Elsewhere she wrote, the sky is the roof of the world, and here the earth was the floor of the sky. The landscape one longed for when one was far away, the thing all about one, the world one actually lived in, was the sky, the sky. The landscape arena and the crops and pastures and prairie beyond the barnyard provided Curry with inspiration from an early age. One of his first oil paintings is the Corn Plower of 1917, years before he emerged on the public stage. On the right-hand side of the screen, again, I've never found the painting, but here we have the horses and the plow and the corn plower from the cornfield, resting, having his siesta under the shady tree. The sketchy stroke and dappled shadows suggest that Curry was painting out of doors, delighting in the impressions of nature, just as earlier Kansas impressionists had done, like Topeka's George Stone with his painting of 1905 on the left-hand side of the screen. Curry's erstwhile field hand on the right daydreams in the shade of a tree, while the rich cornfield stands in the sun, untended, unplowed. Here the agrarian landscape prompts reverie and a harvest of paintings, not produce. The plowboy's crop, albeit untilled, does still suggest an awareness of the farm and its agricultural landscape as an economic unit. As a reminder of that, and as if to rebut more romantic notions of the pastoral life, a photograph in the artist's family album depicting threshing on the Kansas farm on the right-hand side of the screen is inscribed on the back, doubtless in a paternal hand, quote, where the money comes from. Only rarely, however, do Curry's images depict actual labor in the landscape at planting or harvest time, perhaps because for much of his life, Curry managed to live far away from that seasonal grind on the Kansas farm. Recall, he would rather paint manure than pitch it. By that standard, Curry's Kansas Cornfield, the pride of the Wichita Art Museum, is a somewhat unusual work, emphasizing the crop clearly ready for the harvest. The canvas is a large one, 60 by 40 inches. This, however, is but one of the picture's distinctions. For a landscape, if it might fairly be called that, the vertical orientation is unusual, especially in the wide horizontal world of the prairie. It is equally uncommon for a still life, if one prefers thusly to characterize Curry's corn subject, and so too is a sense of the natural still life subject, uncut, still rooted in the ground. Curry's Kansas Cornfield was acquired by the museum as the first purchase through its newly established Murdoch Trust. The artist explained the genesis of the image in a letter to the museum's agent, writing that, quote, "I have tried to put into this painting the drama that I feel in the presence of a luxurious cornfield beneath our windblown Kansas skies." Curry was certainly not the first to be struck by the spectacle of a Midwestern cornfield ripe in the summer sun. James Price, an Englishman who spent several years in the Kansas farmland in the late 19th century, wrote with equivalent fascination of his crop glowing in the setting sun. The sight, he said, was one of simple grandeur. The stalks were now about 5 feet high, covered with massive dark green foliage. The perfect stillness, not a leaf seemed to be moving. The heated atmosphere made a strange feeling of awe steal over me, unquote. When the crop was good, as it often was in Curry's childhood, it was a source of comfort and prosperity for all. William Allen White, for instance, found something royal, he said, in the bounty of King Corn, which called for reverential homage. Perhaps here at the Atchison Corn Carnival, where the Corn King, fashioned of corn, dominates the proceedings in 1905. When the Kansas corn crop was good, White continued, the entire community is included in the promise of the coming kingdom. The days of pinching and running behind and putting up a poor mouth are done, unquote. In these times of plenty, farm communities celebrated the harvest with special festivities. The most spectacular of these was the Corn Carnival held triennially in Atchison, Kansas, where Corn King presided in formal covers of the program in 1905, and the Burlington Railroad's self-proclaimed erection on the left of 1897. Carnivals like this drew thousands of visitors to the town, not far from Curry's home, and garnered press attention throughout the region and far beyond. The Corn Carnival, by one visiting journalist's account, was fame for Atchison, just as Passion Plays did for Oberammergau and the Mardi Gras did for New Orleans. I think proud Atchisonians would be delighted to be likened to the others. And to this day, small-town tourists in the Midwest, small-town boosters in the Midwest seek to lure tourists and their dollars with monuments to the crop, like this welcoming you to Austin, Minnesota on the right. Elsewhere in Kansas of the 19-teens and 20s, the corn grew as high as an elephant's eye, if you will, yielding bountiful harvests which overflowed silos, the piled crop transforming the landscape with what we have called corn dunes, like that photograph about 1918 on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, Kansas artists had long celebrated such fecundity of the land with images of bounty and beneficence, none more delightfully, I believe, than Topeka's Henry Worrell, who painted droughty Kansas on the screen now in 1870. This witty harvest scene with melons as big as boulders and cobs the size of logs and bushels upon bushels of grain sought to dispel Easterners' lingering skepticism about local conditions of climate and agriculture, and was much reproduced in the late 19th century. It now hangs with pride in the Kansas Historical Museum in Topeka. The Midwestern fascination with agricultural gigantism persisted into the 20th century, with large crops and their produce champions on the right, with comic postcards by a Kansas publisher on the upper left, or the delightful WPA mural in Mount Ayr, Iowa, on the left-hand side of the screen by Orb Fisher. Producing fanciful postcards like these and of oversized produce and public murals that similarly immortalize the bountiful harvest. In an age of prosperity, farm wealth was symbolized in the weight and bulk and quantity of prized specimens, an agricultural gauge in which corn figured prominently. In Lucien Bloch's Land of Plenty from the early 1930s on the left, a memorable achievement in social realist printmaking, tall corn and towering electric power lines, the symbols of national prosperity, are ironically juxtaposed with a destitute family cruelly held apart from such promise by a barbed wire fence. Promise offered by fields ripening and green like that on the right. In Curry's Kansas Cornfield, by contrast, now on the screen, the artist and his viewer do not stand apart from the ranks of healthy corn, but instead seem surrounded by them. However, during the summer of 1933, when Curry visited his parents in Kansas, the farm life he recalled from his childhood was under pressure of change. The bountiful harvests of prior years were diminishing, both locally and nationwide. Here's a graph of Iowa corn production of the period, and you can notice the precipitous declines in the 1930s, coincident with the Dust Bowl and other calamities. In Kansas, as well as in Iowa, the acreage devoted to corn was reduced slightly between 1931 and 32, but the yield per acre and the state's overall production fell dramatically from the immediately preceding years. In 1932, for instance, 136,000 bushels were harvested. In 1933, only 80,000. And with that precipitous decline vanished much of the prosperity and optimism of the recent years. The decline in farmers' fortunes was due to diverse factors, most notably overproduction, which lowered prices, followed in some areas by drought, which destroyed the land, as famously photographed by Arthur Rothstein on the left. Moreover, the passage of the Agricultural Adjustment Act in the spring of 1933, one of the major legislative thrusts of President Roosevelt's first 100 days, ensured that acreage formerly dedicated to cultivation would be plowed under, in theory reducing overproduction and raising farm prices. The program proved controversial, even among Midwesterners who might have been thought to benefit from it. Thomas Hart Benton, Curry's Missouri colleague, in 1934 retitled an earlier farm scene as Plowing It Under, his new title, and produced a lithograph from the image, thereby broadening many times over the audience for his pictorial jibe at the AAA subsidy program. The corn that Curry painted in such ripe abundance on his father's farm in 1933, which, like Benton's image, served as the basis for a lithograph, may also convey some message about Roosevelt's agricultural program. At the very least, it suggests that Smith Curry had opted not to plow under his corn acreage to take advantage of the act, the proud stand of corn providing an implicit rebuke to the wasteful policy. The corn subject had other connotations for Curry as well. Kansas may be known familiarly as the sunflower state, a crop whose commercial possibilities were only belatedly recognized, and the wheat is certainly known worldwide, for Shocker country and far beyond. But as the state's Secretary of Agriculture once proclaimed, corn is our monarch cereal. Wheat, he said, has made Kansas famous, but corn makes her rich. corn formed the basis for the agricultural economy in much of the state, especially in the northeastern quadrant of Kansas, in the valleys of the Kaw and Missouri rivers, where the Curry family property lay. Here, a map on the left-hand side of the screen of the Great Corn Belt, identified by geographers and cartographers, referring to those Kansas counties as part of the Great Corn Belt of the Central Lowland, a region where corn's cultivation dominated. Even Frederick Remington recognized this during his brief stint as a Kansas sheep rancher in the 1880s, while he produced a sketch of characteristic agriculture in Kansas. I seem to be. Anyway, with no image, sorry, depicting in his drawing not the familiar cowboy and Indian subjects by which he is known today, but the seasonal cycle of planting, cultivating, and shucking corn. Kansas Cornfield by Curry, then, might be seen as a symbol of his home precinct in northeastern Kansas, remote from the wild country of Barber County and from the wheat fields to the west. Beyond the local, the vegetable could also serve as a sectional symbol, as I believe it does in the painting on the left, Two Kings, Cotton and Corn by Elizabeth Remington, unrelated to Frederick. This was early suggested in her Reconstruction era painting of the two kings, cotton and corn, the cotton providing an agricultural symbol for the former Confederacy, in whose economy it was a mainstay, the corn, by contrast, representing the Union cause in the North. As a proud child of the Free State, Curry might also then have found in the corn a useful symbol for his social as well as his agricultural sympathies. In the 1890s, a campaign to establish corn as the national emblem gathered support from artists and writers around the country. The plant's beauties were extolled. Is there anything of vegetable nature as delicately graduated as this long leaf? Asked one of his champions. And artists were advised to employ its graceful form in painting and design. Even the president was enlisted when Rutherford Hayes proclaimed that, quote, "More corn is the destined emblem of America," unquote. Candace Wheeler, one of the leading designers of the period, used the occasion of the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition in 1893 to champion corn as a national symbol, as Columbia's emblem. The title of her volume on the left is a reissued cover, but the frontispiece on the right is from the original first edition, featuring a still life of corn. In this text, she compiled a selection of prose and verse tributes to the crop, which recommended itself for such purpose, she said, due to its ancient history in the New World, where Aztecs and Incas and the roving bands north and south of these central populations had from time immemorial paid homage to it in rituals and songs and dances, unquote. Modern Americans should do no less, she wrote, for, quote, "No other plant is so typical of our greatness and prosperity as a nation. No other has such artistic meanings and possibilities. No other is as wholly and nobly and historically American." The corn that grew so widely, as one poet wrote, from Superior's shore to Chile, from the ocean of dawn to the west, that corn served aptly as a hemispheric symbol as well. Appropriately, both in the U.S. Capitol in Washington, and I understand in the Canadian Parliament buildings in Ottawa, capitals adorn the motifs of certain areas of this indigenous corn cob. On the right, you see the example in detail from the Senate wing of the U.S. Capitol building. Maize recurs frequently as well in the art of Central and South America, both ancient and modern, like this Mayan mural from the first millennium AD, in which corn stalks with cobs ripened into human heads, suggesting the long lineage of the crop in Mesoamerican art, and providing a distant antecedent for Curry's numerous sketches of the plant, its tumescent cobs bursting with power and fecundity, like the example on the left. When Kansas Cornfield, your painting, was shown in New York, critics were impressed with this life-size portrait of the crop. Margaret Bruning, the reviewer for the New York Evening Post, and one of the most insightful of commentators in her generation, remarked on the artist's nativism, saying that there's too little known of his exquisite paintings of native shrubs and flowers. And she particularly praised the corn paintings, the Wichita paintings, quote, dense mesh of lush vegetation and crisp leaves and flaunting tassels that seemed to rustle and stir in the flashing pattern of light woven through them. In his canvas, Curry had seemingly realized the hope of the plant's earlier advocates that corn would have a delightful effect on wall ornamentation. Curry recalled that as a child, the cornfields on his father's farm held the same fascination for me as do the forests who live within them. This is my granddaughter in a field, lousy picture, cute girl. I remember, he said, wandering through them and being overpowered by the fear of being lost in their great confines. In his schoolboy history lessons, Curry might have remembered tales of children who hid in the cornfields to escape the murderous wrath of Quantrill's Confederate raiders when, in August of 1863, they sacked the abolitionist stronghold of nearby Lawrence. And he likely knew of the elaborate costumes from corn and other crops in which harvest celebrants clad themselves, like the young boy on the right-hand side of the screen. When Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote of, quote, an occult relation between man and the vegetable, he probably was not thinking of the Atchison Corn Carnival. But Curry clearly was when he costumed the figure of grass for a ballet, of which he was the costume designer, on the left-hand side of the screen. Personifications of plants and produce delighted turn-of-the-century audiences, and not only at harvest time. Seed merchants advertised their superior products with a corn maid who decorated the pages of their annual catalogs, like this example from the late 19th century. And co-eds early in the 20th century at the University of Illinois frolicked each spring as Corn Belt maidens, as you see photographed on the right. And old habits don't die. Cornhusker fans at Lincoln still wear costumes on the left. And fairgoers to this year's Iowa State Fair wound up on the front page of the New York Times with their costumes on the right-hand side of the screen. Could Curry possibly have had such exotic precedents in mind when he painted his cornfield as a life-size stalk, if you will, nearly as high as a human's eye? Thomas Craven, the Regionalist chief champion, friend and subject of Curry's drawing on the left, once wrote to Curry to praise, quote, the corn picture. But he admitted that, quote, at first I did not get it. What did Craven not get? Perhaps another instance of an occult relation between man and vegetable? The painter Reginald Marsh, another of Curry's close friends, provides perhaps a clue. He once noted that Curry's painting of a proud bull named Ajax on the right-hand side of the screen, and this familiar image was really a self-portrait of the artist. If Curry could discover self in livestock, might he not do likewise in the crops of the field? What Craven did not appreciate, and what Marsh perhaps only intuited, was that Curry's Kansas cornfield might represent a surrogate self-portrait in regional serial guise. Other artists had humanized the corn stalk, like the California sculptor Donald Hord, whose Young Maize on the right of 1931 personified the ancient American plant looming over germinating seeds. In an earlier generation, the agrarian poet Sidney Lanier, photograph you see on the right, it likewise honored the growth of the corn in a lengthy verse dedicated to corn, similarly posing a single superior stalk which rose above its peers. It's a long poem, I won't read you all of it. It's a dreadful poem, but it does include telling insights about, I'm quoting, "Look, out of line, one tall corn captain stands, advanced beyond the foremost of his bands, and waves his blades upon the very edge." This lustrous stalk drew the poet's attention, for it, quote, "leads the vanguard of his timid time with commanding rhyme." Standing tall in the field, rooted deep in the soil, the cornstalk by example instructed the poet, who, quote, "fain like thee would grow by double increment above below, soul homely as thou art, yet rich in grace like thee, teaching the yeoman selfless chivalry." Lanier praised the towering plant that, quote, "lifteth more stature than a mortal man's, yet ever piercest downward in the mold and keepest hold upon the reverend and steadfast earth that gave thee birth." In his Kansas cornfield painting, John Steuart Curry, I suggest, painted a monument to his Midwestern roots, a memento terra, if you will, from the prodigal who had left the land, an expression of yearning for the reverend earth that gave him birth. The image of Curry as corn captain strangely prefigures a painting by his cohort, Thomas Hart Benton, from 1967, simply titled Wheat. In that work, Benton similarly enlisted a Midwestern crop for personal purposes. Before a stand of ripened wheat, reaching into golden infinity, and behind two already harvested rows, a single blade bends toward the ground. The painting was made late in Benton's life, after the artist had suffered several heart attacks, and long after the premature deaths of his two revered and friends who are honored in the first two rows of cut wheat, cut down too soon. In this simple design, Benton transforms the motifs of his popular heyday into a meditation on life and death, transferred to and transformed by the agrarian setting. Curry, likewise, in Kansas Cornfield, symbolically represents the prodigal's homecoming and a rumination on rootedness. Lanier concluded his agrarian homage by addressing the corn directly, describing a vision of another harvest in another era when one, quote, "with bolder heart, manfully shall take thy part, and tend thee and defend thee with ancient sinew and with modern art." In Curry's modern Kansas cornfield, Sidney Lanier's promise was realized. But even as Curry was discovering his place in the Kansas land and in modern art, other younger painters were emerging, eventually to inundate Curry and the Regionalists. Such was Archibald Gorky, who in the early 1940s discovered in another cornfield a very different vision of art and of life. Gorky's Cornfield of Health, so-called, hangs in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, painted in 1944. In 1946, the last year of Curry's life, the abstract painter Ad Reinhardt, himself soon to join the ranks of the New York School, cartooned this new hearty growth of modern art sprouting from the trunk of Braque, Matisse, and Picasso on the right-hand side of the screen. From the limbs, beneath the splintered limb of subject matter, here you see subject matter originating off of the limb, hang down other weights, seen better in this close-up. Beneath the splintered limb of subject matter and declining regionalism, Reinhardt buried the realist painters, decorating the graves of Curry, Benton and wood with ears of corn, as you see below. 2 months after Reinhardt's drawing appeared, John Steuart Curry was himself laid to rest in a Winchester, Kansas grave, not with corn, but with local stone marking the spot, in death returning to the land with which in life he had so long and prodigally struggled. Thank you very much.